So I am so happy to be speaking with Palana today. And Palana, I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself, let us know a little bit about you, your work, your pronouns, and whatever you think is relevant. So take it away.
Yeah, so I'm Palana, she, her, hers. I am in Rochester, New Hampshire, and I work for the New Hampshire Harm Reduction Coalition as one of their care coordinators. I don't even know. I really struggle to remember exactly what got me into harm reduction, but I know that as I started to hear more about it, it made all of the sense in the world to me, which I guess was something that I was told is something that is difficult to hire for. It's just somebody who can actually just get on board with the principles, and just like, people are people, you should meet people where they're at. And you know, if you can go to the syringe exchanges and you can treat these people like people and not, you know, force stuff on them, you'd probably be pretty good at this job. And I had previously worked as an organizer at the ACLU of New Hampshire, where I was often out in the community meeting with people who felt like they had never been heard before, felt like they had not quite been respected, and just going out, giving them value. As an organizer at the ACLU, I was always just hyping people up and telling them, like, you have so many superpowers, you have a great story, you have a great network of people, you put together great events, you know, just hyping them up on their skills and stuff. So it was a very natural fit to get involved in harm reduction, although it's in, you know, direct care and whatnot. It was an easy thing to start doing. And I also just liked, I had been an elected official for a couple years in Rochester, and, you know, there were people talking all the time about, what do we do about recovery in this area? What do we do about the homelessness problems? What do we do about all these things? And, you know, I thought that getting involved in politics would be a way at the city level to kind of influence what kind of direction we would take there. And I was finding that most people at the municipal level, and even, you know, further up at the state level, don't care about this stuff. They would rather hide all of this than actually talk about it and deal with those things. So, you know, I was looking for ways, how do I actually make a difference? And harm reduction, turns out, was the answer.
Yeah, and that's a great point too. I mean, I think a lot of people are always like, all right, I found this really cool thing. What do I do with this really cool thing? Who is doing this around me? And so, like, what ended up bringing you to the New Hampshire Harm Reduction Coalition? And like, what does the state of kind of harm reduction look like in New Hampshire at this very moment? Because I'm sure it's changed a lot since, you know, or evolved a lot since you first got involved with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could only be described as fate. I think when I was hired, the job, they had tried to hire for it publicly, and they just weren't even attracting candidates that they felt were viable. And it was just a, you know, friend of a friend mentioned, hey, there's the organization is trying to find a care coordinator to be at the syringe exchanges in the Tri-City area, which is where I am. And I just kind of put my name forward, and I was like, I would love to hop on a Zoom with someone from the syringe exchange and just talk, like, figure out, what is it? What is this thing? We chatted. I met with a couple of the board members, the person who was the interim executive director. And it just felt like a really good fit. It was just good timing. It was a job that wasn't posted anywhere. I barely understand how I heard about it, but it was definitely meant to be. What was the second part of this?
Oh, yeah. No, thanks for that. The second part was more like, since I don't know a ton about New Hampshire, and I don't know the other folks watching this about New Hampshire, like, what is kind of going on? Like, what's the movement now around harm reduction? Because, you know, a lot of, like, when I started hearing about it, and I think when it kind of came into more of like the national fold or the national consciousness, was like 2015, like 2014, you know, we saw a lot of overdose deaths start to spike. And then, I mean, now we're at this like fever pitch where it's just so rampant because of, you know, all the adulterants in the drug supply. So like specifically to speak about New Hampshire, what is going on there?
New Hampshire it can be a frustrating state to be in, and sometimes it can be a state that's exciting to be in. So I want to say, I mean, it seems like it was around the same time as what you were saying, like 2014, 2015. I think there started to be conversations around like Narcan should be available via standing orders. There were some immunity laws passed as far as like if you call 911 to report an overdose, they're not going to, bust you for the drugs that you may have, whatever you might have on you, that they just want people to be able to get help. 2017, they passed a law that allowed syringe service programs to actually start to happen, which means that people other than pharmacists can provide syringes. I can drive around with boxes of syringes in my car and not worry about I'm not doing anything illegal, which is really great for practicing harm reduction services. The state has made a couple really interesting choices that have made me happy to be here. Like last year, they passed the law. It's another 911 immunity law, but it's for folks that might be participating in sex work, meaning that, which is something that I think New Hampshire is one of the states that is, kind of being targeted as like, could they be one of the first ones to fully decriminalize elements of sex work? And it could happen. It's hard to say. I'm not as in on the legislative battles there, but there is movement in the right direction. In the last year or so, it seems like a lot of people are really getting down with harm reduction. There's now starting, it isn't just when it started 5 years ago. It was people popping up in the back, like just popping the back of their trunk open and doing syringe exchanges. That still happens. And those are kind of the sites that do the most bulk. But there's a lot of, organizations that don't necessarily do harm reduction that are very proud to be carrying syringes and Narcan and stuff when they go and they do their outreach. There's starting to be more recovery organizations that are seeing recovery and harm reduction are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, harm reduction can be a great tool for then engaging people to get somewhere with their recovery. So I think we're at a really exciting point where there's definitely more syringe exchanges than ever throughout the state, whether they're ones that do bulk like NHHRC does, or they're ones that are, there's a couple groups that just give out starter kits and stuff, and that's enough to keep people safe for a couple days or whatever. So there's a lot of positive movement. I know that there's bipartisan support for it too, which is great. It was a Republican House, Senate, and governor that made the syringe service law happen. So it's pretty exciting stuff. So lots of good movement, I would say.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That's good to hear, because I can't believe I've lived in Connecticut this long and have not made it up to New Hampshire yet. And I'm like, it's not even that far.
I grew up in Massachusetts, and I came to New Hampshire like twice in my life.
Okay, so I don't feel bad.
Before the years leading up to me moving here, the few years prior, I started here quite a bit, and I was like, maybe I want to live here. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I think so. One of the next things, I can't remember if we touched on this a lot last time, is like, what is kind of like the queer culture, if there is any, in New Hampshire, and like, how is that tied into the harm reduction movement, or is that like something that you or other staff members are like actively looking to make those connections to?
I think it's starting to happen now. Yeah. So I mean, the queer community in New Hampshire, I've worked a number of jobs that have been, working with LGBTQ facing populations, both as like the manager of a cafe that had a very queer audience. I worked for the ACLU as their trans justice organizer, helped start a nonprofit called the Affirming Spaces Project. I do some freelance lobbying and stuff on LGBTQ issues. And one of my friends has I think it was while he was running for office, he came up with something, and he said that New Hampshire is gayer than you think, which I really like it, because in New Hampshire things can feel very hidden. It's not that the whole place is rural. I mean, I'm kind of in a pretty busy city, but you don't see a ton of your neighbors. A lot of people keep to themselves. There's an individualist kind of mindset that can happen up here. And, you know, it can be really challenging to sometimes find and connect with your community, but once you're in, it's just like, you're like, oh, there's a lot. There are so many more queer people than I ever thought would be here. I mean, I remember like when I moved to New Hampshire, I was not out as trans yet. I was right on the cusp of about to come out. And I just remember feeling like, it's like, I must be the only person in this city that feels like this. I must be the, you know, like, I would be the first person that people would be meeting who's trans, and that's intimidating to think about. And then when I came out, I mean, like, just right away, it was like, oh, there are dozens of people in my, not even miles from my house, that are also trans or gender non-conforming, and it's maybe not that scary. So, you know, it's really about throwing up your flag and saying like, hey, we're all here. With the harm reduction stuff, yeah, I didn't think about it much when I first got involved in harm reduction, and suddenly I was talking a lot about syringe exchanges and Narcan and just trying to affirm people's personhood, I guess.
Well, not to interrupt you too, but I think like some of what you're getting at makes me think, and this has come up in the other interviews as well, is about like the larger conversation about bodily autonomy, right? Like we're seeing on a national level this attacking. Yes, exactly. And that's why I love your shirt. But so
it was a choice.
The attacking, right, for gender affirming care, trans youth. Now we're seeing it, you know, with the leak that happened recently with Roe versus Wade. So I think, I don't know if you're getting at this, and I want to put words in your mouth, is just we're seeing it's very intentional. And I think that's what like some people still don't realize. Like this is very intentional. You know, people who use drugs, people who inject drugs have been getting attacked way, I mean, since the beginning, like the dawn of time, essentially. But then it really kind of came to light. Like I know with NHRC, we were created in '93, basically out of the you know, movement, like the ACT UP movement,
Yep.
and HIV and AIDS. And I think a lot of organizations were popping up around the same time. So I'll kind of, you know, leave you with that bit. I don't know if that jogs you, but.
It does. Yeah, and that's something where in New Hampshire, like we were a state where just a couple years ago, 4 years ago, they became, I think it was at the time, the 19th state to pass comprehensive gender identity non-discrimination protections. The year after, we were able to follow it up by expanding non-discrimination to healthcare, to public schools. There was a bill that expanded gender markers to include non-binary markers on state ID. And there were a couple really good years. And then there's just been so much backlash to all of that progress and just fear mongering, specifically around, you know, like trans bodies and what they are and what they aren't. And it's hard. I was actually I was with a group of people yesterday who all work in LGBTQ activism, and we were talking about like things are getting really scary now. There's just a lot of bills being introduced here where it's like people want to bring back conversion therapy. People want to allow for discrimination, you know, when it comes to very certain things, you know, like in areas that would, you know, and they try to say that it's not about trans people, but it's like in the area of incarceration, athletics, and, you know, whatever they are. And it's like, okay, this is very clearly about transgender people, particularly, you know, trans kids. That's what it's really seems to be about now is, you know, like in Alabama, this is like a state that is essentially forcing people to detransition. Like, when has that ever happened? A state coming in and saying, this is, you know, so a lot of bodily autonomy type stuff. Here's what I found though. This is where I just remembered where I was going. Is that, you know, like when I first started talking a lot about all this stuff to my friends, although a lot of people weren't necessarily familiar with all the ins and outs and the intricacies of the language that I was, like kind of tossing out there and using and trying to affirm the personhood of different people, but that just like the compassion of the LGBTQ community, and recognizing that there's just like recognizing that this is people who use their language and try to use the law to like stigmatize people, whether it's in regards to reproductive access or LGBTQ people or people who use drugs. It's the same energy,
No, 100%. And I was giving you a thumbs up because I'm like, I have to keep myself on mute because I'll just like blab. But it's frustrating too. And like sitting in this position, the new position that I have within NHRC, it's interesting, right? Like trying to get people in the harm reduction community to give a shit about queer rights and queer happenings and queer health, and then it's queer folks trying to give a shit about people using drugs. Because like if you look at the Venn diagram, it's like this. I mean, it's just like there's so much crossover, there's so much overlap, so much, and it's like these two movements are the same. And until we can liberate, and I don't want to sound like just that person that's speaking platitudes, but like once we liberate all people, particularly we're liberating our Black, queer, trans femme folks, we're really going to be liberating everybody. And I think a lot of folks, and I talk about this a lot, whether it's family, friends, other people in the community, it's not a zero-sum game. And I think people are so quick to forget that and think that just because we're maybe enacting something here, supporting one cause, that we're just going to be left out and left behind, right? There's this like shouting, this like screaming match of like, okay, well, my rights are being affected because, I identify as such and such. And it's like, no, that's not how any of this works. And we've been trying to tell you that for years.
And the opposition loves that. They want you to be siloed. They want to break people down and, for them to not recognize what their collective power is. And I think in New Hampshire, I've been seeing a lot of really great movement in the last year. It's just as far as, it's like people making intentional efforts to like work across lines and be like, if we want a sustainable queer movement, we better be showing up for BLM together. We better be showing up for the repro stuff together. And if I think one of the most exciting things going on in New Hampshire in the last year is, New Hampshire had gone, I want to say decades without a dedicated reproductive fund. Maybe it had been a decade. They hadn't had a repro fund in quite a while. And there's a group of people who came together and they started the New Hampshire Reproductive Freedom Fund. And, like a lot of people early on were kind of like poo-pooing the idea. And like, I know that there were like, even from higher ups, Planned Parenthoods of the world and stuff, we're just kind of like, we don't really know if we want another organization in the thing, but they don't have the ability to stop people from doing stuff. And the Reproductive Freedom Fund is like thriving. They have paid staff members now. Like they're doing some really, really great work. And it's refreshingly radical and intersectional. Like they're able to draw these lines between it's like, keep all your laws off of our body. There's a lot of queer folks who are involved in that particular effort too. So yeah, I think that's been one of the more exciting things that's been going on. And I know that, they've been, I think yesterday, one of the people who was involved with it was telling me that, they saw more support in the last week than they did over like their first 2 years trying to get it off the ground. And they're just providing like a serious amount of just care and really focusing very heavily on the mutual aid part of it, like trying to build up those networks of people who can bring people to an appointment, who can provide, just follow up with people and, check in on them and whatnot. And like, I think that there's like I think that there's a want and a need to then also extend that kind of stuff to people who are maybe accessing trans healthcare here in New Hampshire, because it's a real just care desert up here. That's there are not enough I mean, I think this is a problem everywhere with just bottlenecking of medical services. There are not enough providers of certain specialties that are able to provide adequate care to people. So a lot of people in New Hampshire are still relying on, I mean, and they're great services, but they have to go to the queer health centers. They have to go to the Equality Health Center or Planned Parenthood or the Lovering Center, which are the three places that do, just one-stop informed consent, HRT kind of stuff. It can be really difficult to find primary care that knows, really how to like interact with trans folks and provide adequate care. There are, I want to say, surprisingly, I don't even know how this is the case because we're in New England, and it's kind of like it's especially being close to Boston, it's just perceived as it's like you can get any kind of medical care that you want. But like if you look at gender confirming surgery and whatnot, in New England, there are so few places that you can access that care. There's 2 hospitals in Boston that I know of that do it, and they do quite a bit, but 2 hospitals in Boston, 1 in New Hampshire, nothing in Vermont, nothing in Maine. And outside of those 2 spots in Massachusetts, even, like, there's not really anything. I know a lot of people who travel down to Boston to go get their medical care because they're just like, I could go to the LGBTQ health center in Boston, full service. They do my blood work, my primary care. They do everything that I need. I do have to drive 3 hours both ways to get there, but to them, that's better. They just want to go and have that like stigma-free experience where they're not going in. They're not worried about getting misgendered. They're not worried about their doctor not understanding something. I think it's a really common thing in trans healthcare. I think and it can be refreshing, but more often than not to go into your doctor and have to like teach them something and be like, no, actually, that's not what's happening with my body right now. Actually, I did some research and it might be this. And I've even had instances where my doctor's like, oh, yeah, I think you're probably right. It's like, why am I going to the doctor then?
Right. Yes. There's this constant like burden placed on trans folks to educate the provider. And like you're saying too, the access problem is so big. It's like, even with the advent of things like, organizations like Folks Health or Plume, it's not accessible to everybody because it can be expensive. It's a monthly prescription. Like, you have telemedicine, telehealth, and that's great. But like, what if you don't have consistent like Wi-Fi or cell service, or you
and
don't
that's
have
a huge problem in New Hampshire is that there are really big portions of the state, all things considered, that don't really have high-speed internet yet. They have to get, I was actually somewhere a few days ago, and they have to get like their internet like satellited into their location because, it's just the population is so thinly settled that, internet companies are like, well, we're not going to run a high-speed line up there if, there's 60 people in your town way up north. And, there's a lot of issues with being able to access, with all the things that telehealth has helped with. It's also opened up a whole different set of problems for some other people who might not have internet, who might not, have like a working phone at the moment or something. Just phones are expensive. It's amazing that we all managed to, find our
they are
$100 a month for whatever we're paying for our phones. So
absolutely. I was just talking to someone yesterday also for this project, and they're up in Ithaca, New York, and they're talking about how literally their job was like, all right, well, we can't stop providing services and care to people. So once the pandemic was happening, and this was like April of 2020, they said their job was like, here's a cell phone, go out to the community, and then we'll do, like MAT. So we'll do treatment out there for people in the field. And like, that's brilliant, right? Because instead of being like, okay, we can't possibly give phones or provide iPads to everybody or like give them internet, it's just not realistic. We don't have the resources or funds to do that. Let's send people out to do it and then make it more accessible. But I think when you're talking about like rural communities, and I know you said you're in a city, there's just a whole nother set of challenges, and people often get neglected and forgotten about. Because even with like, you saying that people are driving to Boston to get their care. I mean, it's ridiculous, but at the same time, at least those folks have a way of getting there, right? There's a lot of people who are stuck and they're like, I don't have a car, or like, I don't have someone that could drive me, or I don't have a license, or, you know, especially if you're a trans youth and you want to get hormones, you want to get started, but your guardian or your parents or whoever is in your life is not supportive, you're kind of locked in, right? And to your point before, when we look at what's happening in Alabama, it's a felony now, right? It's basically a felony. It's a crime punishable by 10 years to provide blockers, hormones, or any other kind of affirming care. And I think that's to youth under 19. So it's like there's such the disparity. My point is like the disparity is kind of like closing, right? Where it used to be a lot of people in New England being like, this is New England, nothing bad ever happens here. We're so out and we're open. And they're like, yeah, Texas and Florida and Alabama, that would never happen here. And now I think what we were talking about earlier is that that's kind of getting diminished. And now the lines are getting blurred and there are bills popping up. And like I live in Connecticut, and Connecticut is, you know, usually the person will be like, this is not happening here. But we, just a couple years ago, had a huge thing with like the ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, pretty much a terrorist organization coming in and ridiculing these two Black transgender athletes, these two girls on the track team in Connecticut. And, you know, the parents got involved, the kids, they were writing letters, making it.
And you know what's even crazier about that is that, so like, they regularly come up as the only examples in New Hampshire. You know, like we're like when the attempts to ban trans athletic participation happened in New Hampshire, they just pivot to the Connecticut girls. And it's like that's just an example of like two girls who worked hard and were good at what they did. There's no categorical dominance. There's no like, have you ever seen that graphic? It's like, of the United States, it's totally empty, and it's like states where transgender girls are dominating sports, and the whole map is empty. There are examples, but honestly, with how many transgender people there are, it's surprising that there aren't more people. You know, if anything, trans athletes are underrepresented right now. So.
Absolutely, like the Leah Thomas thing, right? That was so overblown, blown out of proportion, and everybody was just hinging on that and like upholding that, right? They're like, oh my gosh, look at what's happening. There's this like dominance happening, and everybody's like a biological expert or something. It's like when COVID happened, everyone's like, see, look at this article I found. I'm an epidemiologist now, and I know everything about COVID. And it's like people didn't really give a shit or didn't start caring until it was just this like hyper politicized thing of like, okay, we're gonna just like target trans people now, which I would argue that trans people have always been targeted. It's been codified in different ways, right? Like when we talk about sex work, or even when we talk about people using drugs, like those were ways to kind of control the narrative and to kind of push people to the side. But it to your point very early on in the conversation, is incredibly dangerous right now. I mean, things are like,
if you look at those athletic bans that are passing and whatnot, like those are going to hurt cisgender girls probably more, because now it's creating this culture of like people who are just going to start being like, you know, it's that's a man, we need to do testing, we need to do all that kind of, you know, and it's like
body policing. 100%. It's this weird surveillance thing. It's really out of control. And I mean, and this is like a whole another thing, but I think what it really boils down to, and a lot of people I think similarly, is this conversation about eugenics and who's like really allowed to be here, who's not allowed to be here. I mean, if you want to get really real, that's
for real. That is what it is.
Very, very plainly, you know, to cut all the BS, you can cut through all of it, and that's fundamentally what's at its core. And people won't say that. They'll just do all this fancy stuff. And like what's wild too is like Chase Strangey always talks about, because there was like it was some kind of like trans awareness week that was going on right before T-Dub to build up to it, which is great. I think it was in its second year, and he and Raquel Willis were talking about all the bills going on in different states, and Chase was essentially like, there is a playbook, like there's very much a playbook that all of these, you know, very conservative politicians have, and like their teams will read through it and be like, we're just going to throw bills. Like they don't even know what's really in it, but they're just like, this is going to be good for my reelection, or this is going to, you know, help the party out, and we're just going to throw these things out. And it's so wild to think about that. Like, there's just no rationale or thought. They're just like, oh yeah, you know, like Texas just passed this thing, Florida did, so now we're going to do this in our state just because that's like the flavor of the week, and we'll put like 20 bills out there and we'll see which ones stick. And you know, because that's kind of like the culture now.
Whereas it's like, I think I want to say the other day I read something about like there's like very real evidence that just these like bills being put forward and families being concerned about, like, it's like, can my family continue to live in this state? Like, it's having a real impact on, you know, like trans people and their families, thinking about like am I going to be able to get their medication next month? Is my student going to be supported, or is my kid going to be supported at school? Is, you know, and that stress is real. And I know families, you know, that have had such bad experiences here in New Hampshire that they have gone as far as, you know, like researching into like, I think we need to move. You know, and I don't know anyone who's actually ended up doing it yet, but it's a very real thing where people are, you know, really concerned about just their safety, and it's having a really big impact on their families, and it's whether or not they become law or not, even just by tossing it out there and having it take up pages in the newspaper, time on the radio, whatever it is.
Yeah, it's harmful. Any way you slice and dice it, it's harmful. And you know, whether or not you want to get into this portion, I think that's a good segue, like, into the political realm, and that's something you're familiar with. There's a Republican incumbent right now, right? In Rochester, in your city, there's someone that you're running against.
Well, actually, I already lost.
You already lost? Oh no.
I lost 5 months ago, I think.
5 months ago? But
yeah.
Can you talk about the significance of that, though, and like what the support was? Because I'm sure that you did have a good amount of people. I mean, I'm sure people gave you hell, right? Just because of history and what we know. But I'm sure there were also people who are like, this is really freaking rad that we have someone who's going to challenge this person who, I don't know how many years he's been sitting as mayor, but I'm sure a while.
Yeah. So, you know, the surprises all around is the way that I'm going to start the conversation. You know, like, so when I ran for city council a couple of years ago, I went out door to door in my ward, in my neighborhood, a place I hadn't lived for that long, but am intending to spend quite a bit of time in. And I went door to door. I didn't tell anyone that I was trans or anything. You know, I didn't lead with that. I was just going around and saying, hey, this is what I really like this place. I'm really feeling it. I think I want to get involved and be on council. And, you know, most people just saw this person who was really young and excited and energized and walking around every weekend for 3 months, you know, trying to get votes. And then when I won, it was the first time that a transgender person was elected to city council in the state of New Hampshire. So the local paper wrote, you know, it's like, transgender candidate wins historic election or something like that. And a lot of people were just like, oh, I didn't know that. And for the most part, it was people saying that for the better. You know, they were like, good point. She didn't go around and say, like, trying to do something around my identity. She just cares a lot about the city and the town. There were, you know, working as a city councilor, most people were very respectful. They just saw me as a person. They were excited for me. There were no issues. But then there were times, and it was clear, where, you know, someone would have an issue with you. It wasn't about your stance on something. It wasn't about the position that you took on something. It was purely because they heard that you were trans. So when I ran for mayor, I knew I would potentially be attracting some attention, you know, because it was now known, even though I didn't go out again, and I'm not like, hey, I'm the trans candidate for mayor or whatever. But, you know, that's what people saw it as. And it was most of the time very, very good. But then there were times where you just get messages that were so negative and went so out of the way to just be mean, and people that refused to either use female pronouns or any, I preferred it when they didn't want to use any pronouns, and they would just be like, this person is that. I'm like, all right, well, at least you didn't say he. But then there were people who were going out of their way to be like, he's a blah, blah, blah. And then, on like the day of the election, there was this one guy that I was standing at the polls with my sign. I was talking to him. We agreed. He was just kind of like asking me like, what do you stand for? And I'm telling him all this stuff. And it seemed like we agreed on everything. And then he just kind of casually is like, I heard that this like, man trying to be a woman is running or whatever. And I was just like very just like triggered, and I kind of like shut off, and I was like, all right. And I, stopped paying attention to him. And then, he's like, why won't you pay attention to me? He was a little unhinged. And then, I'm like, it's like, cause you're talking about me right now. And then he started laying into me, and like someone had to get in between us. And he was so agitated, and very clearly he went in and voted for this other person who does not share his values, because he was so upset just that I existed. And there were several other instances like that where someone would just like, yell at you. A lot of internet comments. I read them all.
And they always say never read the comments, right? For that reason.
So, there were wins and misses to it, but ultimately I think in the mayoral race that I probably not enough votes to have won the race, but I lost votes purely over
just your identity.
My identity had nothing to do with the race.
Mm-hmm.
I really cared about the city. I had concerns about how the mayor's office had been being used, how it hadn't been used. That was why I ran.
People actively voting against their best interests just because of that person who's running. That is so wild, but I can't think of anything like more American. To be honest, like if you want to get real, and I give you huge props too, because I'm sure you knew like going into it, even though you didn't make your identity like the focal point or like the selling point, that people were going to try to dredge up stuff. Right. Yep. And there were going to be conversations and competition.
And they just immediately jump to things about like, well, you must support things like this and that and this. And it's like, it's just, I don't know, like it has nothing to do with any of those things. So it was challenging, but ultimately I am really happy that I did it, because it got attention like statewide. There were people who were just like, this is an interesting race. And I was just saying things and standing for things while I ran that people don't typically see somebody who wants a mayor stand up for, a mayor that's talking about harm reduction and stuff like that. Our city, Rochester, has had a history of using, like zoning and codes and stuff like that to try to prevent people from setting up recovery organizations in certain spots.
Yeah.
Try to, pressure people to move along to somewhere else. When they see people that they don't like congregated together, there's people in our town who, immediately pivot to like, well, how can we control this with our zoning laws and whatnot? So, I was talking about that kind of stuff, and
yeah,
it really resonated. It struck a nerve, and I heard plenty of people who said that they wanted to try to run for office after seeing it. So
wow,
there's wins in it.
Absolutely. Well, I think that you surprised a lot of people too. Just even getting other folks to be like, hey, I want to throw my hat in the ring and like, let's get this thing going. And you made people uncomfortable, and that's always a good thing.
It's certainly not a bad thing. And again, it's like, anytime that I could, I use that platform to talk about like, here's actually the things that would move the city forward, that would not exclude residents, that would, because part of it is just like, well, we just need our property values to rise so much that then, people who don't have houses, who are accessing recovery services, just can't even be here anymore. And geographically, just Rochester, we're kind of like at the end of the line where we are a city, where then above us, there are no more cities there's a small city, maybe like 2 hours north of us, but like we are at the end of the public transit, so it's like a lot of people who have ended up here have been pushed out of other cities to the south of us as they price up. And now it's like, I don't think the people are going to go any further. They can't.
They can't.
We are the last bus stops. We are the last Walmarts for, like the places that people rely on to get what they need. So.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, it was an interesting experience. I don't know what my future as far as running for office looks like again, because this particular round was exhausting and it has had lingering effects. There's like people, like somebody the other day at a syringe exchange, somebody who doesn't like the syringe exchanges, who works near one, came over to me, was saying some condescending stuff to me, and then went on Facebook, tagged me, and was like, I'm so glad that she lost her run for mayor. She's a monster. She said that she would move the syringe exchange. And it's just like taking my words out of context. And also it's just like, I'm not even in office anymore, dude. Like,
wow.
I don't have any control over this. Lay off. Like,
yeah. Oh my gosh. Just like the condescension, just the entitlement that people have regarding this. I could go on forever, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but what I will leave you with is I want to give you space for, like, I always ask people too, is like, what do you think the future of harm reduction is, or even your own future? I know you said that you don't plan on running for office in the near future, but like, where do you see all this going? I mean, we are in scary times. We talked about that a lot, but is there hope? I would like to think there is, like, what's going to happen?
I would like to think that there's a lot of hope right now. Like I said, like in New Hampshire, we've been seeing a lot of places that have not embraced harm reduction practices that are either starting to do it, they're interested in doing it, they want to be partners in it. I think that there's a lot of room and excitement around the potential of like expanding some of these mutual aid type things, like a repro fund, but like doing it as like a transition fund or something, like, like I think there's a lot of energy and potential to do that work here in New Hampshire. And I think that part of why New Hampshire gives us that challenge is because we are a state that has no income tax. We have no sales tax. Most municipalities make their purely have to go off property taxes. Property taxes are very, very high here. But all of that being said, the state we live in a state that very, very, very specifically does not provide for us in the way that other states do. We lack a lot of services and, infrastructure investments that other states get. So in New Hampshire, it's like we don't really have any other option but to show up and do things outside of the realm of government. Which is just that was something that I was even feeling as a counselor. That's like, you can have such a big impact on your community doing things like mutual aid and whatnot. Even just like giving food to people. Like, it's just, taking care of one another.
Yeah, the most basic things, right? Who would have thought?
I think that there's a real appetite for that here too. There's a lot of people who are seeing, it's like, well, we've been in these political fights trying to get better healthcare access, trying to get, we've been trying to attract excitement and, investment in things at a higher level, and it's not working. So we just have to go out and do those things. So New Hampshire presents a unique challenge, and it's one that I think there's like a lot of people who are ready to kind of rise to it and, make it happen. So I'm really optimistic, although like it can be really scary to think about the legal and, just kind of the legal part of it all, and potentially things that are happening in our state house. There are a lot of really, really good people here that want to do things. And I think it really pushes us in a way to need to innovate in ways that people in other states might not need to, I don't know.
Yeah. It's a lot. No, I appreciate your, you know, your earnestness, your thoughts on that. And I appreciate you for doing the work you do and even sitting down and talking to me, because sometimes, like, even though this is our passion, it is exhausting. To your point, like running for mayor, I'm sure that was exhausting. Like doing the work, like, I don't think people realize the toll that it takes on us, right? Where this is our lives, our identities, and we're constantly having to find ways to take care of our own and make it better. And that
Yeah,
inherently is very exhausting, right? Like a lot of people that I talk to, especially in harm reduction, the queer community, they're like, if I wasn't queer, like, I don't know if I'd be doing this work, because it like hinges on my survival and like what I need to do and my lived experience. And you know, we're trying to actively like work ourselves out of jobs, but I don't see how that's ever going to be a possibility, especially right now. I mean, we need everybody at the front lines, everybody leading the charge. And I definitely see you as that person in New Hampshire. You know, I'm glad to hear there are a lot of other folks that are charged up,
there's a
but I
lot
see
of
you leading
reasons.
that.
I'm
Yeah.
really quick to deflect the spotlight from me and like put up like a mirror, be like, all right, this is I don't want this. Like you're all you. I don't know.
You could have been that spark though, I think. And I mean, it's fair. It shouldn't just hinge on one person. I mean, that's just not indicative of the movement at large, but it's worth it.
Yeah, and that's like part of the thing too, is that, you know, like about over the last few years, like there's a lot of fights that I've taken on where people end up like turning to me for something, but I'm not even necessarily like in charge of anything. Yeah, I think what's next for me though is like continuing all the harm reduction stuff, but also so after I was at the ACLU, I'd run their trans justice program. We were doing a lot of really good like proactive work and not just being on the defense. There hasn't been a lot of good proactive, I don't know, like large scale social, legislative, educational type work going on in the state. And I think that there's going to be there. I think that in the near future, there will be an organization dedicated to like LGBTQ progress in the state of New Hampshire, because there hasn't been one. It's always very piecemeal,
Right.
and it kind of fits in with my behind the scenes type vibe too, where it's like I would rather just help get this thing up and going, get other people into the positions of power that need to be there, and then probably send it off on its own, and you know, then you have something else.
Yeah, I hear that and I feel that. Well, anyway, thank you again for your time, just chatting with me, you know, learning and allowing other people around the country to learn about you too, because like I said, this project involves so many folks. You know, we have folks from Georgia, from Colorado, from New York, Massachusetts, now you in New Hampshire. I mean, it's amazing just to see the variety and the disparities, you know, between what's going on West Coast, East Coast, and even just the differences I see in Massachusetts versus Connecticut and New York and New Hampshire. And people think that New England is some kind of mecca, which in some ways it might be for folks that have absolutely nothing.
Good few years maybe, but there's a lot of scary stuff going on, and
there is absolutely. So anyway, that's all I got for now, but I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other.